The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the elderly black woman standing at the center of the room. Her posture was calm, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet intensity that hinted at a storm brewing beneath the surface. She wore a simple dress, her silver hair neatly styled, and her hands clasped gently in front of her. To anyone who didn't know better, she might have seemed like just another grandmother, someone who'd come to court to support a loved one or settle a minor dispute. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. At the front of the room, Officer Dan Harris leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He was young, cocky, and confident. Too confident. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a shine, and his attitude, well, that was sharper than the creases in his pants. He'd been called to testify in what he thought was a routine case, something he'd done dozens of times before. But this time, something felt different. The woman standing before him didn't seem intimidated by his presence. If anything, she looked amused. And that bothered him a lot. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you understand the gravity of this situation? This isn't exactly a knitting circle." A few people in the gallery chuckled nervously, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying him, and for a moment, Harris felt a flicker of unease, but he brushed it off. She was just an old woman after all. What could she possibly do? The judge, a stern-faced man with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, cleared his throat. "Officer Harris, let's keep this professional, shall we?" Harris nodded, but the smirk didn't leave his face. He was enjoying this, the power he felt in this room, the authority his badge gave him. He didn't notice the way the woman's gaze hardened, or the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the folder she was holding. As the proceedings continued, Harris's attitude didn't improve. He interrupted her, talked over her, and even rolled his eyes at one point. It was as if he couldn't help himself, as if the sight of this unassuming woman standing her ground was a personal affront to him. But then, something changed. The woman stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor," she said, "I believe it's time we cut through the theatrics and get to the heart of the matter." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick you could almost taste it. Harris opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Proceed," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman. She nodded, then turned to face Harris. For the first time, he noticed the folder in her hands wasn't just any folder. It was stamped with the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His stomach dropped. "Officer Harris," she began, her voice steady but laced with an edge that made his blood run cold. "You've spent the last hour mocking me, dismissing me, and underestimating me. But before you dig yourself any deeper, there's something you should know." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine waiting to drop. "I'm not just a witness in this case. I'm Special Agent in Charge Evelyn Carter, Director of the FBI's field office in this district." The room erupted in gasps. Harris's face went pale, his cocky demeanor evaporating in an instant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman, no, Director Carter, smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Now," she continued, her tone icy, "let's talk about why you're really here." The screen fades to black, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. What happens next? What secrets is Director Carter about to reveal? And how will Officer Harris, once so confident, now visibly shaken, respond? The tension is palpable, the stakes higher than ever. This is just the beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every pair of eyes was locked on Director Evelyn Carter. The elderly black woman who had just revealed herself to be one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement. Officer Dan Harris, who had been so smug just moments ago, now looked like a man who had just realized he'd stepped into a trap. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the witness stand, his mind racing to process what had just happened. How had he not known? How had he missed the signs? And more importantly, what did this mean for him? Director Carter didn't wait for him to recover. She opened the folder in her hands, pulling out a stack of documents that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Your Honor," she said, addressing the judge with a calm authority that commanded respect. "This case goes far beyond what's been presented today. What we're dealing with here isn't just a simple matter of procedure or protocol. It's about accountability, integrity, and the abuse of power." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, as if she were laying the foundation for something much larger. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable but his interest clearly piqued. "Go on, Director Carter," he said, his voice low and measured. Harris, meanwhile, felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He glanced at his lawyer, who was frantically flipping through notes, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. The gallery, filled with a mix of curious onlookers and court staff, buzzed with whispered speculation. What was going on? What had Officer Harris done to draw the attention of the FBI? Director Carter took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Officer Harris," she began, turning her gaze back to him. "You've been on our radar for some time now. This isn't about today's testimony or your conduct in this courtroom. This is about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that suggests a serious breach of public trust." She paused, letting the words sink in. Harris felt his stomach churn. He wanted to protest, to deny everything, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. This wasn't a bluff. She knew something big. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Director Carter, are you suggesting that Officer Harris is under investigation by the FBI?" The question sent a ripple through the room. Harris's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting loudly, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. "I'll allow this line of questioning," he said firmly. "But Director Carter, I expect you to provide evidence to support your claims." Carter nodded, her expression unflinching. "Of course, Your Honor." She turned back to Harris, her gaze piercing. "Officer Harris, do you recall an incident 6 months ago involving a traffic stop on the outskirts of the city? A young man named Marcus Johnson." Harris's heart skipped a beat. Marcus Johnson. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't quite place it. He shook his head, trying to appear confused, but the flicker of recognition in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "Let me refresh your memory," Carter continued, her tone steady but relentless. "Marcus Johnson was pulled over for a broken taillight. According to your report, he became combative, and you were forced to use physical restraint to subdue him. He was arrested and charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Sound familiar?" Harris nodded slowly, his mind racing. He remembered now. Marcus had been just another kid, another statistic. But something about the way Carter was looking at him made him feel like there was more to the story. "What you didn't include in your report," Carter said, her voice hardening, "was the fact that Marcus Johnson was unarmed, that he never laid a hand on you, and that the entire incident was captured on a dashcam that mysteriously malfunctioned before the footage could be reviewed." Harris's blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to protest, but Carter cut him off. "And that's not all," she said, pulling another document from the folder. "This is just one example in a series of incidents that suggest a troubling pattern of misconduct. Misconduct that we believe extends far beyond Officer Harris." The room erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the tension was palpable. Harris felt like the walls were closing in on him. He wanted to scream, to deny everything, but the weight of Carter's accusations, and the evidence she seemed to have, was crushing. His lawyer was scribbling furiously on a notepad, but Harris knew there was no easy way out of this. Not now. Director Carter turned back to the judge, her expression grave. Your Honor, this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allows, and in some cases, encourages, this kind of behavior. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. And it's about ensuring that justice is served, not just for Marcus Johnson, but for every person who has been wronged by those sworn to protect them. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of contemplation. Director Carter, are you suggesting that this case is part of a larger investigation? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And while I can't go into detail at this time, I can assure you that what we've uncovered so far is just the tip of the iceberg. The screen fades to black once more, leaving the audience with more questions than answers. Who else is involved in this investigation? What other secrets is Director Carter hiding in that folder? And what will happen to Officer Harris? And the system he represents? When the truth finally comes to light, the stakes are higher than ever, and the tension is only building. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The courtroom was in chaos. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs turned into outright chatter as the implications of Director Carter's words sank in. Officer Harris sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. Marcus Johnson. The name kept echoing in his head, along with the memory of that night. He had been so sure he'd covered his tracks, so confident that no one would ever question his version of events. But now, with Director Carter standing there, holding what looked like a mountain of evidence, he felt the ground crumbling beneath him. The judge banged his gavel again, louder this time, and the room slowly quieted. Director Carter, he said, his voice firm but tinged with curiosity. You've made some serious allegations. If what you're saying is true, this goes far beyond the scope of today's proceedings. I need to know, what exactly are you proposing? Carter didn't hesitate. Your Honor, I'm requesting a temporary halt to this case while the FBI conducts a full investigation into Officer Harris's conduct, and the conduct of others who may be involved. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a culture of impunity that has allowed abuses of power to go unchecked for far too long. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing back on the judge. And it's about ensuring that justice is served, not just for Marcus Johnson, but for every individual who has been failed by the system. The judge leaned back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. He glanced at Harris, then at Carter, and finally, at the gallery, where the tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. This is highly unusual, he said after a long pause. But given the gravity of the situation, I'm inclined to grant your request. This case is adjourned until further notice. Officer Harris, you are to remain available for questioning. Director Carter, I expect a full report on your findings as soon as possible. Harris's lawyer jumped to his feet, his face red with frustration. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client has been blindsided by these accusations, and we've had no time to prepare a defense. This is a clear violation of his rights. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Your client's rights will be protected, counselor, but given the nature of these allegations, I believe it's in the best interest of justice to allow the FBI to proceed. This isn't a trial. It's an investigation. And if Officer Harris has nothing to hide, he has nothing to fear. As the judge's words echoed through the room, Harris felt a sinking sensation in his chest. Nothing to hide. The phrase mocked him, taunting him with the weight of everything he'd done, and everything he'd tried to bury. He glanced at Carter, who was calmly gathering her documents, her expression unreadable. What else did she know? Who else had she talked to? His mind raced, but there were no answers, only questions. Outside the courtroom, the buzz of the crowd grew louder. Reporters had caught wind of the story, and cameras flashed as Director Carter stepped into the hallway. She moved with purpose, her demeanor calm but resolute, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. A young woman in a sharp suit, clearly one of Carter's agents, fell into step beside her. "Director," she said quietly, "we've got a team ready to go. But are you sure about this? Harris is just one guy. If we go after him, it could open a can of worms." Carter didn't break stride. "That's the point, Agent Torres. Harris isn't the problem. He's a symptom of the problem. And if we don't address it now, it's only going to get worse." She paused, glancing over her shoulder at the courtroom doors, where Harris was emerging, flanked by his lawyer and a small crowd of onlookers. "Besides," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "this isn't just about Harris. It's about sending a message. To him, to the department, to everyone who thinks they're above the law." Meanwhile, Harris was doing his best to keep his composure. The reporters swarmed him, shouting questions, but he ignored them, focusing instead on his lawyer's hurried whispers. "We need to get ahead of this," the lawyer said, his voice tense. "If the FBI is digging into your past, we need to know what they're going to find. And we need to know now." Harris nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Marcus Johnson, about the dashcam footage, about all the little details he thought he'd buried. How much did Carter know? And how much could she prove? As he climbed into the back of a waiting car, Harris pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" Harris took a deep breath, his voice low and urgent. "We've got a problem, a big one. Meet me at the usual spot, and bring everything you've got." The screen fades to black once more, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. Who is Harris calling? What secrets are about to come to light? And how far will Director Carter go to uncover the truth? The stakes are higher than ever, and the tension is only building. This story is far from over, and every twist and turn brings us closer to a reckoning that no one, least of all Officer Harris, saw coming. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is going to change everything.